Welcome to Pet Talk. Now it's me and it's Teddy. Teddy, remember to look at the camera. Yeah. And my wonderful guest is Gwen Cooper. Hello, Gwen. Welcome to Pet Talk.
Hello, Teddy.
Well, it's so lovely to speak with you and to have you here. Because one of my favorite books ever was Homer's Odyssey.
Thank you. I thank you. That is, it has been more than 10 years now since the book was published, but it is still lovely to hear from people who enjoyed it.
I still have memories of different scenes, and I keep thinking I'm going to reread it. But I remember laughing so much, and I remember crying a fair amount as well.
That's the dream, right? As a writer, to make people laugh and to make them cry and to give them a story they remember is about as good as you can ask for.
And it's all about Homer. And so I guess my first question to you is, have you always had an affinity for cats?
I grew up in a house with only dogs. We considered ourselves animal lovers, but we only had dogs, and we adopted always rescue dogs. So we were always, all about rescue in my family. I had a cousin who had a lovely cat named Eros, just one of those great, lovely lap buddy kind of cats. And I used to love going over to her house and just sitting with Eros in my lap for hours and hours and just petting him. So I always considered myself to be a person who had an affinity for animals in general. I first adopted my first cat. I adopted because at the time I was living in a small apartment. I was working a lot. I was young. I was working a lot. I wasn't home that much, and so it didn't seem like the right environment to bring a dog into. So I guess I always like deep down in my soul, I sort of always knew that I loved cats at least as much as I loved dogs. But it was not until I was an adult that I finally got a chance to express that.
I think the interesting thing is what a different experience it is, living with cats to living with dogs. For me, the interesting discovery, having had 3 cats and having now living with Teddy, is that there are some very strong similarities, although on the surface there are extraordinary differences, and the differences are huge. And it's the experience of living with them that's so different. Dogs are very direct. Cats are not. You have to really, there's a subtlety to the way they do things.
And which I generally agree with, although I will also say so much of it depends on the cat, right? I mean, because a lot of people, I definitely right now live with a dog cat. Like technically he's a cat, but he's such a dog. There's nothing subtle about him at all. And he loves people. He loves new people. He loves strangers. He loves getting attention from anybody who will pay attention to him. He loves to play fetch. He does not like to hide. He does not leave you guessing about where he is or what he's thinking or what's up with Clayton. He really could not be any more direct in any of his in any meaningful sense, truly. And I've never seen, it's extraordinary. I've never seen anything like it in a cat, although I have heard about, other people say, oh my God, my cat is just like a dog. So our cat Fanny, which I know has different connotations in the UK, but it's not a bad word here. It's very cat-like, but Clayton, it reminds me a lot. Actually, it reminds me so much of the dogs I grew up with.
Well, it's funny because because I started off by saying I find that there are some real similarities between them, and my 3, they were very subtle in the way they communicated, but they were also very dog-like in the way they interacted. So it was a funny combination, because on the one hand they were very friendly, very open, they were very affectionate. I used to have conversations with them where I would give them choices about what they wanted to do, and they would choose. And so in that sense, it was very like living with Teddy. that kind of interaction was very, very much the same. It's just that they were quieter in the way that they went about things. So, okay, with the exception of Cleo, our first one, who used to run down the stairs whenever she heard us arrive, and she would go all the way down. Right. So, but she was quieter in her personality. It's the boisterousness of a lot of dogs, although of course, you know, we're talking generally because dogs have a scale of how boisterous they are. It's just compared to cats, they're high energy.
That is probably true. You know, so it's interesting because I always feel that, you know, Homer's Odyssey has been published in so many languages. And so I have been in touch with so many people around the world, and even in the United States, you know, just within this country, people who are so different from each other in any meaningful way. I mean, different ethnic, religious, racial, economic, political backgrounds, very, very small towns, very, very large cities. Truly, they're so different from each other in so many ways, and yet who all feel the same way. I mean, who all have this commonality with, you know, in loving animals. And it's a cliched kind of thing to say, but it is also true, I think, in these days of great division, to remember that ultimately there is still more that unites than divides us. And I think the same is true with the dog-cat divide. You know, everybody, it is in our nature, I think, to look for ways in which we're different from each other, and to make an us versus them. And we even apply that to the animals in our lives. But I think you're right. Ultimately, dogs and cats have more in common, the experience of living with a dog or a cat. And I say this as someone who is now, my life is really equally divided. Like half of it lived just with dogs and half of it lived just with cats. And they are not such, you know, it's not like a night and day. I hardly recognize that person I used to be who lived with dogs. Like it is very much a continuum. And there is a lot more overlap than there is division.
It's funny because the first time I realized that was when Teddy, he was a puppy, he had just arrived, and he started kneading and circling before he got comfortable.
Yes.
And I sat there mesmerized looking at him thinking, that's what cats do. I didn't know that
the first time I saw cats do that, I'm like, dogs do that. So yes, I had the same experience in reverse.
Yeah, it's like, wow, you know, this is a similarity. It's been such an interesting experience. So yes, it's, and like you know, it's about, I've only had 6 years with Teddy, whereas I had from the age of 13 to 17 with our first, and then there between our other two, I think that might have added up to, you know, close to, you know, 8 years or something like that. So I had a longer time with cats, and it's funny because I've got so wrapped up with Teddy, quite rightly, that everything else is a memory, a treasured, cherished memory. So when I get the chance to be with a cat, it's like, wow, it's the best thing. And I've just been writing today about my latest feline friend who comes and visits me on my allotment. And it's a joy, which brings me to something else I love about cats, is that because people aren't so hung up about them being out on their own, we can actually share in the joy of seeing them and interacting with those who are willing to interact. Do you find that?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I mean, the US versus the UK, I know in US, we are much more about indoor only cats. Although having said that, there are still indoor outdoor cats. I mean, there are no real indoor outdoor dogs, let's say. And it's funny because actually in my neighborhood where I live now, the family across the street from us has this beautiful long-haired black and white cat, you know, this long, I mean, bottle brush, fluffy tail and big green eyes. And he makes the neighborhood rounds every day. Like and sometimes, some days I feed him, sometimes, you know, another family across the street does, not completely. I mean, but he definitely makes the rounds. He sleeps on our deck. He sleeps on somebody else's front porch. And I say he's like the mayor of the neighborhood, basically. And And he, also makes sure that, like, any new people who come in, he makes sure people walking by, he inspects and greets. And yes, I mean, definitely there is much more opportunity to interact. I mean, you see people walking dogs, that of course, but there's much more opportunity to interact with cats on their own terms and not necessarily with their humans around than there are with dogs. I mean, you wouldn't want to see dogs just roaming around your neighborhood. That's a little dystopian, actually, like just packs of feral dogs wandering the streets. It does not sound like a good thing.
Yeah, I've had quite a bit of experience of being in places with that, and it's not comfortable. I would
No,
say.
no.
Not
It's
comfortable.
interesting. I was speaking recently. I don't know if you were familiar with him, with a man named Dean Nicholson, who travels around with a cat named Nala on a bicycle. They've been traveling the world on his bicycle together, and he has told stories about having her in her carrier in the basket on the front of his bicycle, and they are in some parts of the world where there are problems with stray dogs, and just like packs of stray dogs that are following the bicycle or trying to jump at them, and it certainly sounds terrifying. For
Yes,
sure.
it could be absolutely if you've got a cat. Actually, that reminds me, a very treasured memory is of a cat named Peanut, who a friend of mine, she had him as a kitten, and he was not a well kitten, and he was not. I think he lived to a year, but not much more than that. But because of his condition, she took him everywhere. She never left him alone. And I have these lovely pictures and memories of her turning up with Peanut on my doorstep, and her coming for a walk with Peanut, um, and Teddy, of course. And so the four of us setting out into the woods for walks, and me being a bit nervous, thinking, are we going to run into dogs that are going to be aggressive to Peanut? And
Sure.
Teddy adoring Peanut and walking alongside her, holding Peanut, looking as if he was worshiping a goddess because she had Peanut. so, so when you see
They certainly all have their own personalities, and you cannot always tell from looking. I mean, this is definitely something I found. Obviously there are large dogs who are gentle, and small dogs who are very nippy. Who are very nippy little dogs, and then of course there are the nightmare big scary dogs, and all of that. But definitely. And I think this again speaks to the commonality between dogs and cats. I mean, something that I learned at a very young age about dogs, so I really was prepared to understand it as an adult living with cats, is that they all have their own personalities. They really do, each one have their own personality, and there's only so far you can predict based on species or breed what an animal is going to be like, and what it's going to be like to live with them.
it's I think I've been working on a book about raising Teddy, and I have it within my heart, this idea that actually we need to remember we're one species. And if we could remember that we are all one species, then everyone matters. And how we interact with each other is absolutely respectful. And that's the feeling that I have. And it seems to be that the more interaction I have with different animals, the more I understand how similar they are to each other, but actually how much we are similar to them. And it's learning how to teach Teddy brought me right back to when I was teaching children, and remembering about being positive rewards, how to motivate. All of those things are there for all different species. So this is actually not something that I thought we were going to be talking about today, but there it is. You can't quite help it, can you, when you're talking about when you've got two people who are familiar with both species.
Yes, it's interesting. I was recently having a conversation with a naturalist and an author named Cy Montgomery, who you may know of. And she was saying something very similar in that ultimately all creatures, you know, love their lives and you know, want to be alive and have something to offer. And I mean, she was also speaking to how much more we have in common. You know, again, I mean, to the theme of there being more that unites than divides us. And I mean, but of course, this is why it's always, you know, this is actually, I find to be one actual great divide, is that animal lovers can never understand how other people don't get upset when animals suffer. And people who are not animal lovers don't understand why those of us who are care so much about animals who aren't people. And that is actually, I think, one of the few maybe unbridgeable divides, or maybe experience is ultimately what bridges that divide. You know, I think there are some people who don't really understand it until they start living with an animal, and then their love for that one animal maybe will bring them to a greater understanding. But I always do find that divide, like you know, people like us really cannot quite get our heads around the indifference of others who can't quite get their heads around why we care so much.
Funny, because I find that with some people and children as well.
Yeah.
There are some people, I can remember when I was a teacher, and I wasn't, there was a part of my teaching career where I wasn't class-based. I was working within the school as a special needs teacher. And it was interesting because I would go into the reception or nursery area, you know, where children are very young, often dirty for one reason or another, very often sticky. You know what little children are like. And it never fazed me when they would want to come and, you know, throw their arms around me or ask for a cuddle. But I do remember seeing people who would recoil.
Well, you know, I will say that I think part of being someone who's comfortable with children or animals is being comfortable with goo. I mean, with a certain goo factor. You know, I will not say, like, you know, when one of my cats throws up on the stairs or gets diarrhea on the rug, or I mean, when I had cats who were older, and you know, lots of things would happen with their bodies that you know, and various bodily fluids, or things that wouldn't normally be fluids but that suddenly were fluids. And none of it is like my favorite thing about living with animals or anything, but I also, like, whatever, it is what it is. You know, life is dirty, and it can't all be sunshine and roses. And I think that is part of it. I think, like, some people, and I think there have been studies on this, you know, the disgust reflex, and some people have a very, very strong disgust reflex, and some people do not. And obviously there are two ends of the spectrum, but I think the closer you are to not having an easily triggered disgust reflex, the more comfortable you probably are with children, the elderly, animals, you know, those among us who, let's say, have less control or fewer manners, where the various gooey things that can come out of the body are concerned.
I think actually that's a really important point, because what you talked about is control. And I think that there are people who don't like things that appear to be out of control, and that they're uncomfortable with things that are out of control. And so nature becomes a challenge. You know, being out in nature is challenging, being with animals is challenging, perhaps being with children is just about okay, but for some, even that's challenging. So I think this is, I think it's a mindset, in a sense, that we're talking about. And incidentally, in no way are you and I intending to be judgmental.
Right.
We're making an observation of what it takes actually to be able to be intimate with an animal, because it is an intimate thing to live with an animal, because they'll come and jump on you, they'll come and jump on your bed, lick your face, you know, and that's something that they're not going to do to just anybody. And equally, you're not necessarily going to appreciate that from another animal. You might do, but it might be a little bit harder to accept a dog licking your face if you've never met this dog before.
Sure.
But
Although I'm really fine with, I mean, I grew up, we also, in addition to dogs we lived with, I mean, we had foster dogs and dogs were in and out. So, I mean, I think, it comes down to so many factors and I mean, again, like with the animals we raise, and it's always that combination of the circumstances in which you're raised versus your innate inborn personality traits. I mean, I grew up to be very whatever about dogs licking me, like dogs I knew, dogs I didn't know, dogs on the street, like whatever. It was, I probably spent a good 50% of my childhood covered in dog spit. and it just was what it was. Maybe if I had grown up differently, I would have become an adult who was a little more, keep that drooly dog away from me. So, and again, it is also, I mean, certainly not about being judgmental. It really is about for various reasons, there are some people who are more comfortable with certain things than with others. I remember, I was never a very squeamish person. I remember years ago, living with my boyfriend down in Miami, who was a great animal lover. And at the time, I remember this was like, 25 years ago, the Discovery Channel would show like actual surgery, or the Learning Channel on TV. And I would be sitting there like eating a tuna sandwich and watching surgery, like actual surgery on TV. And my boyfriend would come like, "Oh, what is wrong with you? How can you watch that?" And it just, was not a thing that ever grossed me out. So again, there really is, it grossed him out, but animals didn't gross him out. So it's always about where you fall on the continuum, I guess.
exactly, it's true. Well, we've referred to Homer's Odyssey, and I think it might be nice to let people in on what it is.
Sure, of course. It's certainly not a secret or anything. So yeah, Homer's Odyssey was a memoir that I published a little over 10 years ago about my blind cat, Homer. Homer was found as a very small kitten I'm from Miami originally, and he was found as a 2 or 3 week old kitten wandering the streets on his own with a very progressed eye infection. And a couple found him and took him to a vet who, as it happened, was my veterinarian. And their feeling was that the kindest thing to do would be, they brought him to her basically for her to humanely put him down, essentially. But she had worked with blind animals before, and she was also very young at the time and idealistic, and she felt that an animal who had, a cat who'd always been blind, who'd really never been able to see, would not know that he was blind, would not know the difference, and would simply accept, the reality of this. And it may seem a little strange now for people to think that somebody would want to, I think it's such a different ballgame in an era of social media and YouTube, but it's hard for me to remember now sometimes that when I first adopted Homer, and really up until 7 or 8 years ago, I didn't know anyone else who had a blind cat. I'd never even really heard of anyone else who had a blind cat, or a cat who was missing eyes, or anything like that. Now, social media is just awash in all kinds of cats and dogs, and with different abilities and disabilities and appearances and things that once you would never have thought of, like it would never have occurred to you, or just there, and you see them in a newsfeed very casually going by. But at the time, it was almost a radical proposition to save this, for this vet to, on a pro bono basis, save this cat's life, and then try to find a home for him. And nobody wanted to adopt him because again, it's hard to sort of think of that now, but people, didn't know what would be entailed in adopting a blind cat, or what kind of life a blind cat could have. And it was really only because I'm a tremendous sucker who, on hearing the story about this blind kitten, I was like, well, I'll meet him, I guess, but I'm not promising anything. And the rest, as they say, is history. I definitely got, suckered into it. And then once I met him, I couldn't leave him there.
No, and what struck me about him was not the way he adapted to being blind. That, to me, that was quite a natural thing that he would do, and all the things he got up to despite being blind. That was wonderful, but it didn't It didn't surprise me. What I think struck me was how incredibly brave he was, and how and that really moved me, was his courage. That really struck me. I
Yeah, no, he was an incredibly. I always, I always just say he was like the Joe Pesci of cats, in that he was so little. He was a really little cat, but he was always ready to like throw himself into the fray. And on the rare occasions where it fell upon him to fight in some way or for something, and I mean the natural story, and not to leave listeners in suspense, but there's an episode that I recall in the book, where my apartment was broken into in the middle of the night while I was in bed asleep. And Homer chased this, 4 a.m. chased this burglar out of my bedroom and out of the apartment, and then proceeded to chase him out of the apartment, like down the hall and to the fire exit, before I finally caught up with him and dragged him back. And I mean, and he was ready to hurt someone. And again, he was, even by cat standards, he was a very, very small, slender, skinny, little, tiny, small boned cat. And I think part of it was that he couldn't see. So he had no idea like how high the thing he was jumping off of was, or how much smaller he was than other cats or than people. My husband used to, who was like the comic book nerd when he was a kid, used to say that like the superhero Daredevil would, in some of the stories, get his vision back temporarily and be afraid to do the things all of a sudden that he routinely did as the superhero Daredevil. Once he could actually see what he was doing, he's like, I'm not jumping off that. Are you crazy? And so the predictions with Homer initially were that he would be very timid, and much more timid than other cats. And I think for some blind cats that is the case. But in Homer's case, I think in not being able to see a lot of the things that scare a lot of cats or a lot of people, he couldn't see them, so he wasn't scared by them. And in his mind, he was as big as anybody. I always come back to that. And he was as big as anybody. And he never let himself be intimidated.
No, and I love that. I think also, the fact that he lived in his own territory on his terms, and that he knew it well, played a part. But that is the episode it's one of the episodes that stayed in my mind, was the image of this small cat, absolutely determined that he was going to protect his home and you, and that was all there was to it. And I think in that instance, it must have been pure instinct, because he may not have known the level of danger that he could be putting himself in, but he knew there was danger, and that was his reaction to the danger. Well,
I think the most animal, right? I mean, the most animal instinct. I mean, this is a real lizard brain thing, fight or flight, And I think animals who are not as prone to overthinking as humans can be, you decide early on, which, like, my other 2 cats had chosen flight. They were nowhere to be seen. You decide very early on which of the 2 you're going to pick, but it is a binary thing. It's fight or it's flight. Talking your way out of it is never an option. I mean, that is one stark difference between humans and all other animals, right? They're not going to negotiate. They're not going to reason. They're not going to say, all right, calm down. What can we, it's fight or it's flight. And with Homer, it was always fight. My other 2 cats, it was always flight. They were, and my 2 cats now actually are definitely also, they're flight cats. But for Homer, it was always, and I don't think they truly understand that it's life or death, but I think on some instinctive level they do. I think that's why, I think that, for Homer, I think that's part of the reason why he immediately, I mean, he went after this guy, and there's no doubt in my mind that if he'd been able to catch up to this guy, he would have attacked him with everything he had in him. I mean, it really was this my sweet loving cat, and all of a sudden in that moment, I really did not recognize this snarling, angry animal who really did want to hurt someone in that moment. I mean, I was afraid, if you had told me 10 minutes earlier that there would ever be a moment where I would be afraid of Homer, I would have thought it was nuts. And so I think on some level they do, without like sitting and without being able to articulate it in those words, I think he did understand that it was a life or death thing. Certainly if he caught up with this guy, it was a life or death thing. I think he was just determined it was not going to be his life on the line.
I think it's clear that they have that sense. Sometimes they are overreacting. I mean, Teddy is a classic overreactor. And yes, it is always a fight instinct. There is no question of flight or appeasement, because, you know, some animals do engage in appeasing behavior, depending on how afraid they are. But with Teddy, absolutely not. It is fight, and it is fight, and it is to the death. And I have the most terrifying time was when he decided that it was a Rottweiler who was the enemy. And you can imagine, you know, this fluffy cockapoo versus a Rottweiler who
I don't like to think about it, but yes.
Yeah. And what he does is he becomes the fiercest, meanest dog you can imagine in his mind. And of course, the Rottweiler, who would otherwise perhaps have not even noticed him, thinks, oh my God, he means business. So I've actually engaged in desensitizing him to Rottweilers. But it's whenever but I have to always make sure that he's not afraid. So I think that for them, always it is when you have those extreme reactions, they absolutely are convinced that they are in definite danger. It's a life-death situation. And sometimes it isn't. Is their overreaction.
Well, of course. I mean, so the truth of the matter is Homer's life was never at any point threatened. I mean, if Homer liked the other two cats and hid under the bed, you know, whatever might have happened to me, nothing would have happened. No one came to that apartment looking to mess with some cats. But, you know, to that point, because I remember somebody, you know, I mean, there have definitely been people over the years who have been skeptical that somebody would have been afraid of this small blind cat. And my first thought is always like if you see a cat with no eyes and I mean, especially again back in the 90s before there was social media, probably the kind of, I mean, so if this is what you see for like all of a sudden you're in a dark room, the lights go on, and facing you is a snarling black cat who has no eyes. In and of itself, that's got to be kind of freaky if it's just something you're not like, what does this woman do to her cats, you know? But even taking that out of the equation, I always say that I would sooner take a punch from a drunk in a bar than let any animal bite me. Like the smallest squirrel in the park could definitely get me on the ropes just by running at me and acting like he was going to bite me. I mean, I think it's a very human thing. We would much rather get into altercations with each other than be bitten or clawed or scratched by any animal. I think it's a real instinctive thing, you know, like I mean, I think this guy ran because he just didn't want a cat jumping in his face, even if he intellectually knew that he could probably take the cat in a hand-to-hand fight. You know, you don't want an angry cat jumping at your face. If I had threatened to punch him, he would have been, I'm sure, completely unintimidated, even though I'm substantially bigger than my cats. That's a different thing.
It's the unpredictability of an animal who is in full rage. I think
having your skin pierced by teeth and claws, you know, it's one thing to get bruises or even a broken bone from I think like you don't want an animal's tooth in your skin, you know, it's just a real instinctive thing.
So there he is, beautiful Homer, and a book which I shall always treasure. What have you been up to since?
Yeah, so, you know, since then I've written a few more books. I wrote a novel called Love Saves the Day, and it is narrated primarily from a rescue tabby's point of view. And it is named, I don't know if you remember the movie Desperately Seeking Susan with Madonna. So, and if you remember that, yes, here's my husband is helpfully handing me here's the cover of the book. Love Saves, this is the hardcover. But anyway, so in that movie, Madonna trades her boots for a pyramid jacket, or her pyramid jacket rather, for a pair of boots, and sets the whole movie in motion. That store was called Love Saves the Day, the vintage store she went into. So it's set in the Lower East Side of New York. It's told primarily from a rescue cat's perspective. And that was my next book after Homer's Odyssey. I also, a couple of years ago, published another memoir about Homer and the other cats who I've lived with, and it's called My Life in a Cat House. And so that's a kind of a fun book. And I've been self-publishing a few titles. So if you just go to Amazon and you look for Gwen Cooper, you'll see some of my self-published books. I have one called Spray Anything, which again is another series of memoirs. And I also have a book called The Book of Possum, Head Bonks, Raspy Tongues, and 101 Reasons Why Cats Make Us So, So Happy. And I am now working on the Homer Whodunit Cozy Mystery series. And so this is a series of murder mysteries set in a town very much like South Beach in the 90s, where Homer and I lived. And Homer uses his enhanced other senses to help solve murders. So that is, of course, a fictional series, but it is the Homer Whodunit. And the first book is called You Only Live 9 Times. And it will be coming out this fall. So I'm very excited about that.
I love that. I love that idea. I love the titles.
Homer the crime fighting cat. I mean, going back to Homer chasing I always had this idea of Homer as a crime fighter. So I decided finally to make it a reality.
I love it. And I love a book that gives you 101 reasons to love cats. I love it. I'm already
working on the next one because there's so many more than 101.
It's 101. I think it's just a very small beginning.
A drop in the ocean.
Absolutely. What is your favorite thing about cats?
So I just wrote this book, 101 Reasons. You know what? Actually, my favorite thing about cats, they're so perfectly lap sized. And I say this, and I mean, I love, like I'm one of those people, part of what I love about animals is just that tactile experience of cuddling up with them. Big dogs are great to just cuddle up with in bed or have kind of leaning into you and you just feel the bulk of them. And that's awesome. As are little dogs and teeny tiny little kittens, who are so fuzzy, but a full grown cat, even whether, he's small for his size or even kind of big, they're all just perfectly lap sized. It's like cats were designed to fit perfectly in human laps. And I just love that about them, because there is just really no better creature for just sitting on the couch, and having just feeling in your lap, and it's comforting for you and it's comforting for them. And it's just such a great one of the great tactile pleasures in life is just having a purring cat snuggled in your lap.
I used to love whenever autumn came and I'd start wearing woolly jumpers and or sweaters, and my cats always loved that, and they would sit there kneading the sleeves of my
yes.
my woolly. And I loved that. And I'm going to show you so everyone can see. This is a blanket which I made, and I made it because I like to have my feet cozy, and in the winter when they're on the floor they get a bit cold, and I put my I wrap my feet in my blanket. Well, that was the intention when I made this blanket, but every single one of my cats took ownership of this blanket in or another. I would have it on my lap and they would knead it with great joy. And always this blanket was a feature of their lives. And of course, now Teddy has claimed it as well. So
that's great. It's like an heirloom almost. It's passed down from generation to generation of the animals in your life.
Exactly. This blanket is now connected with every one of my animals. So that's a lovely memory you've brought back. I think possibly my favorite thing about cats is the purring.
They are the only animals who purr.
Yeah, I love the purring. There's something, I don't know whether it matches up with our heart rate or something, but there's definitely something about that sound that makes us just relax.
Well, I can tell you, and this is actually something because I, of course, in my book, 101 Reasons Why Cats Make Us Happy, of course, I address the subject of purrs. And actually, medical studies have shown that the purring of cats can reduce inflammation and heart disease in the body, and it also promotes the faster healing of bones and broken tissue. So there is legitimately something, I mean, for the cats themselves, but also if a purring cat is lying on you, then that benefit transfers to you. And so you may have noticed sometimes cats at the vet's office, or if they're not feeling well, they purr as a way not to express their happiness, but to self-comfort. There is actually something physically healing, and it has to do with the frequency. And I mean, there really is, you can look this up, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's a specific frequency at which cats purr that is linked to physical healing. And so your sense of that as being something very soothing and comforting and nurturing is legitimate. It's not just a psychological thing. It is actually physically good for you if you are not well, or you need, or you have broken bones, to have a purring cat nearby.
It's such a comfort. You were talking about it's so comforting. And also, the very fact that they only do it if they feel like it.
Yeah.
Anybody watching this right now who has a cat will be familiar with the experience of really needing to get up to go to the toilet and not wanting to because they've got the cat on their lap.
I wouldn't know anything about that. I have no idea what you're talking about.
we all know the minute they're on our lap, we do not want to move.
Everything defers to the purr. It's everything else stops.
And it's also the way they jump on us, isn't it?
Yeah.
When we're, my last cat, Honey, she used to want to type whenever I was typing on my computer. She wanted to imitate what I was doing. I don't know what she thought I was doing, but I'd be typing on my laptop and she would be on my lap with my laptop. And the next thing I'd know is she'd be putting her paws on there, but going up and down, like my fingers were going up and down. It used to make me laugh so much whenever she did that. It was, yes, 101 reasons. No, there's a lot more.
And again, it's, and this is because, cats obviously, and my theory is that they don't know what we're doing with computers, but they think it cannot possibly be as interesting as they are. But there was actually a NASA engineer who was working from home during COVID, and so was using his home computer to control a Mars rover. And he left to go to the bathroom temporarily, and his cat Sparkle temporarily gained control of the rover, and a small amount of chaos ensued. Fortunately, there was no one around on Mars for Sparkle to hurt with by not quite knowing what she was doing navigation wise. But occasionally, cats can even use computers to take over NASA aircraft. So
I love that. I don't think we could end on a better story than that. That image is on my mind, and I just wish I could get hold of the footage.
It's if you Google, I swear to God, if you Google like NASA Sparkle, you'll probably find it. Or you can find it an account of it truly in my book. It was something that happened as I was writing the book, and I said this definitely has to go in. So one of the 101 reasons to love cats is because cats can control NASA spacecraft.
Really? Oh goodness. Yeah, that's left me a bit speechless, actually.
You really can't top it. That's why the old show business adage is never work with children or animals. It's, how do you top that?
Love that. I think that's just such a gem. Gwen, if people want to get a hold of your books, find out more about you, because actually there is a very important thing that you do, and you work with a lot of cat rescues, don't you?
I do, yes. And I've always felt, particularly because Homer was a special needs cat, and really since my earliest childhood, I mean, animal rescue has always been something that's been important to my whole family. So yes, I've always been very involved with rescue, and people who want to learn more about the work that I do or some of the rescue organizations I work with can go to my website, gwencooper.com, GwenCooper.com, and There's information about books in my bio and organizations I work with and all that kind of good stuff.
Wonderful. Gwen, I want to say thank you very much. My co-host has decided to take a nap elsewhere, so he's, he's not here to say goodbye, but I want to thank you on behalf of us and all the cats out there for your wonderful work. And I hope that you'll be back on Pet Talk sometime when, oh yes, when your new book is released. I think we must.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. You've been watching Pet Talk, and next week we are going to be talking about dogs. So join us then. Goodbye.